On May 5, 1945, one of the strangest battles of the Second World War unfolded in the Austrian Alps. American soldiers fought alongside German soldiers against the Waffen-SS. It sounds like something taken from an alternate history novel. But every major event in this story really happened. By the spring of 1945, Nazi Germany was collapsing. Adolf Hitler was dead. Berlin had fallen. Soviet troops occupied the German capital, while Allied armies advanced from the west. Across Europe, German units were surrendering or abandoning their positions. Yet, not everyone was willing to accept that the war was over. Fanatical Waffen-SS formations continued fighting, convinced that surrender was nothing more than betrayal. Even as Germany disintegrated around them, these units remained determined to carry out their orders and punish anyone they considered a traitor. Just over the border in western Austria stood Castle Itter, a medieval fortress overlooking the Brixental Valley. Built centuries earlier as a defensive stronghold, the castle had been transformed during the war into an unusual prison under the administration of the Dachau concentration camp. Unlike ordinary prisons or prisoner-of-war camps, Castle Itter held a very specific group of inmates. Its prisoners were some of France's most important political and military figures. Among them were former French Prime Ministers Édouard Daladier and Paul Reynaud. There were also Generals Maurice Gamelin and Maxime Weygand, both of whom had commanded the French army during the early stages of the war. Trade union leader Léon Jouhaux was imprisoned there, as was Marie-Agnès Caillot, the sister of Charles de Gaulle. Another prisoner was Michel Clemenceau, son of former French Prime Minister Georges Clemenceau. One of the castle's most famous inmates, however, wasn't a politician or a general. It was Jean Borotra. Before the war, Borotra had been one of the world's greatest tennis players, winning Wimbledon twice and helping France dominate international tennis during the 1920s and 1930s. His athletic ability had earned him the nickname the Bounding Basque, a reference to his remarkable speed and energy on the court. Although conditions were better than in most concentration camps, the prisoners remained captives of Nazi Germany. Ironically, many of the prisoners disliked each other almost as much as they disliked their captors. Several had been bitter political rivals before France fell in 1940. Despite sharing the same captivity, they were far from united. By early May, however, those political disputes became insignificant. The front lines were moving rapidly toward Austria. German military authority was collapsing. Communication between units had broken down. Rumors spread through the castle almost daily, but no one knew exactly where Allied forces were or how long it would take for them to arrive. Then, something unexpected happened. The SS guards responsible for the prison began disappearing. Some fled during the night, others simply abandoned their posts as Germany's defeat became impossible to deny. At first, this appeared to be the beginning of the prisoners' freedom. Instead, it created an even greater danger. The guards had left, but the war had not. Small groups of Waffen-SS soldiers were still operating throughout the region. Many refused to surrender, and reports circulated that these units were executing deserters, resistance members, and anyone suspected of cooperating with the Allies. If a determined SS force reached the castle before American troops did, the prominent French captives could easily be executed. Realizing that waiting was no longer an option, the prisoners searched for someone willing to leave the safety of the castle and find Allied forces. The task fell to a Yugoslav prisoner named Zvonimir Chuchkovic. Carrying a message requesting immediate assistance, Chuchkovic slipped away from Castle Itter and began making his way through the Austrian countryside. His mission was simple in theory: find the Americans. In reality, it was anything but. The roads were filled with retreating German soldiers, scattered SS units, refugees fleeing the fighting, and isolated pockets of resistance. The front lines changed almost by the hour, making it nearly impossible to know who controlled any particular village. Meanwhile, back at the castle, the remaining prisoners could do nothing except wait. Every passing hour increased the chance that someone else would arrive before the Americans, and the next visitors might not come to offer liberation. They might come to eliminate every witness before the Third Reich disappeared forever. While Zvonimir Chuchkovic searched for American forces, events outside the castle were unfolding just as rapidly. Only a few kilometers away, in the town of Wrgl, a German army officer named Major Josef Gangl faced a decision that would define the final days of his life. Gangl had served in the Wehrmacht throughout the war. Like millions of German soldiers, he had fought under the orders of Nazi Germany for years. But by May 1945, Gangl understood Hitler was dead and the war was lost. For Gangl, continuing to fight no longer served any military purpose. Instead, his attention turned to protecting the civilians living in Wörgl. The town sat directly in the path of retreating Waffen-SS units. Unlike many regular Wehrmacht formations that had begun surrendering to the Allies, several SS groups remained determined to continue fighting. They viewed anyone willing to surrender or cooperate with the enemy as a traitor, including their fellow Germans. Gangl had already begun working with members of the Austrian resistance to keep unnecessary fighting away from the town. His goal was no longer victory. It was survival. Before long, word reached him about Castle Itter. Gangl understood immediately the danger the French prisoners trapped inside were in. His own men were too few to defend the castle alone. If there was any hope of saving the prisoners, he would need American assistance. Not far away, elements of the U.S. 12th Armored Division were advancing through Austria as part of the Allied drive toward southern Germany. Among them was Lieutenant John Jack Lee, Jr., commander of a small force from the 23rd Tank Battalion. Lee had spent months fighting across Europe. His unit had crossed France, pushed into Germany, and now found itself advancing through the collapsing Third Reich during its final days. When Gangl located American troops, he made a remarkable proposal offering his cooperation. His information about the area could help the Americans, and together they might be able to rescue the prisoners at Castle Itter before the SS reached them. After hearing Gangl's proposal, Lee recognized the situation was unlike anything he had faced before and agreed to help. So Lee assembled a small rescue force instead. The group consisted of only a handful of American soldiers, supported by a single M4 Sherman tank nicknamed Besatten Jenny. Gangl joined them with around a dozen German soldiers who had chosen to stand with him rather than continue serving the collapsing Nazi regime. Together, Americans and Germans climbed aboard their vehicles and headed toward Castle Itter. By the time Lee's force reached Castle Itter, the prisoners had already begun preparing for the worst. When the vehicles finally appeared outside the walls, relief quickly gave way to surprise. The Americans were expected. The German soldiers standing beside them were not. Inside the castle, introductions were brief. There was no time for lengthy explanations. Lee immediately inspected the castle's defenses. Although built centuries earlier, Castle Itter occupied a naturally strong position on elevated ground, surrounded by thick stone walls. It could be defended against a much larger force, but only for so long. There were very few of the defenders. Lee positioned Besatten Jenny outside the main entrance, where its machine guns and main cannon could cover the road leading toward the castle. American soldiers established firing positions overlooking the surrounding hillsides. Gangl's German troops took up positions alongside them. For perhaps the first time in the war, American and German soldiers prepared to fight shoulder to shoulder. The castle's famous prisoners refused to remain passive. Lee had hoped they would stay safely inside while trained soldiers defended the fortress. Instead, several insisted on helping. Weapons were distributed throughout the castle. Former politicians, retired generals, and other prisoners took up rifles and prepared to defend themselves if the walls were breached. Some had spent years imprisoned by the Nazis. Now they were preparing to fight for their own freedom. It was one of the most unlikely alliances of the Second World War. Each had arrived there by an entirely different path. Now they shared a single objective: hold the castle until reinforcements arrived. On the morning of May 5, 1945, Waffen-SS troops began surrounding Castle Itter. The battle was about to begin. The first shots echoed through the valley shortly after dawn. From their positions around Castle Itter, the defenders watched as Waffen-SS soldiers advanced through the surrounding woods, using the trees and uneven terrain for cover. No one knew exactly how many attackers were approaching. Later estimates would place the force at well over 100 men, giving the SS a significant numerical advantage over the small garrison defending the castle. The Americans, Germans, and French defenders waited until the attackers moved within range before opening fire. Rifle and machine gun fire quickly transformed the quiet valley into an active battlefield. From its position near the main gate, Besatten Jenny joined the fight. The Sherman's machine guns swept the road leading toward the castle, forcing the first SS assault to fall back into cover. The tank did more than add firepower. Positioned at the entrance, it prevented the SS from launching a direct assault on the castle. The Waffen-SS quickly spread out around the castle, searching for weaker approaches while maintaining constant pressure with rifle and machine gun fire. Bullets shattered windows throughout the fortress, stone walls chipped apart as rounds struck the ancient masonry. Inside, everyone understood that this would not be a short exchange of fire. The battle settled into a siege. Throughout the morning, the SS launched repeated attacks from different directions, hoping to overwhelm the defenders through constant pressure. Each assault met the same response. American soldiers fired from windows and defensive positions overlooking the valley. Gangel's German troops covered exposed approaches to the castle. The French prisoners carried ammunition, reloaded weapons, and in several cases joined the fighting themselves. The alliance that had seemed impossible only hours earlier was now functioning as a single defensive force. Outside the walls, the attackers gradually adjusted their tactics. Instead of charging directly toward the entrance, they concentrated their fire on the defenders' strongest advantage, the Sherman tank. As long as Besatten Jenny remained operational, every approach to the castle was exposed to its weapons. The SS brought heavier fire to bear against it. Before long, a well-placed round struck the Sherman. The impact disabled the tank, ending its role in the battle. Smoke poured from the vehicle as it sat motionless outside the entrance. Fortunately for the defenders, most of its crew had already withdrawn to safer positions before the tank was knocked out. Although no longer able to fight, the Sherman had served its purpose. For hours, it had delayed the attackers and prevented them from launching a direct assault on the main gate. Now, the defenders faced a much more difficult battle. Without the tank's support, every rifleman inside the castle became even more important. The destruction of Besatten created another serious problem. The defenders lost their most reliable means of communicating with nearby American units. If reinforcements were already on the way, no one inside the castle knew how close they were. If they weren't, the defenders would eventually be left to fight alone. The battle continued into the afternoon. The sound of gunfire rarely stopped. Whenever the SS attempted to move closer to the walls, concentrated fire forced them back. Whenever the defenders tried to observe enemy movements, sniper fire drove them into cover. Neither side managed to gain a decisive advantage, but time was no longer working in the defenders' favor. Ammunition supplies were steadily shrinking. The castle had not been stocked to withstand a prolonged siege. As the hours passed, the defenders became increasingly careful with every shot they fired. Major Joseph Gangel moved continuously between firing positions, checking on both his German soldiers and the American defenders. His knowledge of the terrain proved invaluable, allowing him to identify likely avenues of attack and direct men wherever the pressure was greatest. Despite the danger, he repeatedly exposed himself while coordinating the defense. Then, during one of the fiercest exchanges of the battle, disaster struck. Former French Prime Minister Paul Reynaud had moved into an exposed position inside the castle grounds. Whether attempting to observe the attackers or simply caught in the wrong place at the wrong time, he suddenly came under enemy fire. Gangel, ignoring the bullets striking around him, rushed toward Reynaud, intending to pull him back into cover. Before he could reach safety, a single rifle shot struck Gangel. He collapsed and died moments later. Major Joseph Gangel died defending a man who, only days earlier, had been a prisoner of the regime Gangel had once served. He became the only defender killed during the battle. His death deeply affected everyone inside the castle. The man who had brought this unlikely alliance together was gone, yet there was no time to mourn. The Waffen-SS remained outside the walls. By mid-afternoon, the situation inside Castle Itter had become critical. Many of the rifles inside the castle had only a handful of rounds remaining. Machine gun ammunition was nearly exhausted, and with the Sherman destroyed, the defenders had no heavy weapons left to stop a determined assault. Outside the walls, the Waffen-SS sensed the change, and their attacks became more aggressive. The defenders answered every advance, but they could no longer afford to fire freely. Each shot had to count. Lieutenant Jack Lee understood that without reinforcements, it was only a matter of time before the defenders were overwhelmed. Their only hope was to somehow reach nearby American units. The problem was obvious. Anyone attempting to leave the castle would have to cross ground watched by the Waffen-SS. The chances of making it through alive appeared extremely small. It was then that Jean Borotre stepped forward. Long before the war, Borotre had earned an international reputation as one of France's greatest tennis players. His speed, stamina, and remarkable athleticism had made him one of the sport's biggest stars. Now, at 46 years old, those same abilities might offer the defenders one final chance. Baratra volunteered to leave the castle and find American troops. It was an extraordinarily dangerous mission. If discovered, he would almost certainly be captured or killed before traveling very far. Even if he escaped the SS positions surrounding the castle, there was no guarantee he would find Allied soldiers before it was too late. As the other defenders continued exchanging fire with the attackers, Baratra prepared to leave. Taking advantage of a moment when the fighting shifted toward another side of the castle, he climbed over the outer wall and disappeared into the surrounding countryside. For several tense minutes, no one inside the castle knew whether he had survived. Baratra moved quickly across the rugged terrain surrounding the fortress, avoiding roads and open ground whenever possible. The forests covering the hillsides offered concealment, but they also hid armed SS patrols still operating throughout the area. Every movement carried enormous risk. Eventually, after making his way beyond the German positions, Baratra encountered advancing American troops. He explained the desperate situation at Castle Itter and the small force attempting to defend it. The message reached officers of the 142nd Infantry Regiment, part of the U.S. 36th Infantry Division. Until that moment, they had been unaware that an isolated group of American soldiers, German Wehrmacht troops, and French prisoners were still fighting inside the castle. The response was immediate. American infantrymen quickly organized a relief force and began moving toward Castle Itter. Back at the fortress, however, the defenders had no idea whether Baratra had succeeded. From their perspective, nothing had changed. Every passing minute increased the likelihood that the Waffen-SS would launch one final assault before darkness fell. Inside the castle, the defenders prepared themselves for exactly that. Weapons were checked one final time. The remaining ammunition was distributed as evenly as possible. Then, another sound reached the defenders. It came from somewhere beyond the surrounding hills, the unmistakable rumble of approaching military vehicles. At first, no one inside the castle could be certain who was coming. In the confusion of Germany's final days, it could just as easily have been another German unit. But as the vehicles drew closer, a different sound followed, the sharp, unmistakable crack of American rifles opening fire. Relief had finally arrived. American infantrymen from the 142nd Infantry Regiment advanced rapidly toward Castle Itter, engaging the Waffen-SS from the rear and flanks. Caught between the newly arrived American force and the defenders inside the castle, the SS suddenly found themselves fighting on two fronts. The advantage they had built throughout the day disappeared within minutes. As the relief force pushed closer, the defenders inside the castle renewed their own fire, targeting SS positions that had been pinning them down for hours. The coordinated attack shattered the momentum of the assault. Some SS soldiers continued fighting, while others fled into the surrounding woods before being captured. After hours of continuous combat, the Battle of Castle Itter was over. The prisoners who had spent years under Nazi captivity were finally free. Against overwhelming odds, the small group defending the castle had held long enough for help to arrive. For the Americans, the mission had begun as a small rescue operation. Instead, it had become one of the most unusual engagements of the entire war. The victory, however, came at a cost. Major Joseph Gangl had been killed while protecting former French Prime Minister Paul Reynaud. His decision to stand against the Waffen-SS ultimately cost him his life. Today, Gangl is remembered in Austria for helping protect the people of Wörgl during the final days of the war. A street in the town now bears his name, recognizing the role he played during one of the conflict's final and most extraordinary battles. The defenders of Castle Itter also remembered the American officer who chose to help them when waiting for larger reinforcements would almost certainly have been the safer decision. Lieutenant John Jack Lee, Jr. was later awarded the Distinguished Service Cross, the United States Army's second highest decoration for extraordinary heroism in combat. His leadership had helped transform a desperate situation into a successful defense. Jean Baratra's remarkable escape also became one of the defining moments of the battle. The former Wimbledon champion had crossed enemy-held territory under constant danger, carrying the message that ultimately brought American reinforcements to the castle. Without that mission, the outcome could have been very different. For the French prisoners, the battle marked the end of years of imprisonment. Men who had once led governments, commanded armies, and shaped the future of France walked out of Castle Itter alive. The Battle of Castle Itter officially ended on May 5, 1945. Just 2 days later, on May 7th, Germany signed the Act of Unconditional Surrender at Reims. The surrender came into effect the following day, bringing the war in Europe to an end. Castle Itter had taken place during the final hours of the Third Reich. It remains one of the last battles fought on the European front. For years, American and German soldiers had fought each other across North Africa, Italy, France, Belgium, and Germany itself. Thousands had died on both sides. But on that day in Austria, those old enemies stood behind the same walls, sharing ammunition, defending the same position, and trusting one another with their lives. Their common enemy was no longer each other. It was a fanatical Waffen-SS force, determined to continue fighting even after Germany's defeat had become inevitable. The Battle of Castle Itter did not change the outcome of World War II. Germany would surrender just 2 days later. Yet it remains one of the conflict's most extraordinary episodes. For a single day, former enemies defended the same castle against a common foe. A German officer gave his life protecting a French statesman. An American commander trusted German soldiers who had been his enemies only days before. And a former Wimbledon champion crossed an active battlefield to save everyone inside. If this story had been written as fiction, many would have called it unbelievable. Instead, it became one of the most remarkable true stories of the Second World War. The Battle of Castle Itter remains proof that history is often stranger than fiction. This was a real tale from history.